At the restaurant, my sister Kelsey announced to everyone, "Get out of here, go find another table. This one's for family, not adopted girls." They all laughed and agreed. Then the waiter placed a $2,400 bill in front of me for their entire engagement dinner. I smiled, took a sip of my water, and paid the bill. But after the transaction cleared, I heard Kelsey scream, "Just a moment, please." Before I tell you exactly how I made them regret that sentence, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The wind on the rooftop terrace cut through my coat, but I didn't feel cold. I felt calibrated. Inside the glass walls of the lounge, my adoptive family was raising their champagne flutes. My father, David, was laughing at something my mother, Christina, whispered. My sister, the bride-to-be, was beaming her hand, resting on the arm of her wealthy fiancé. They looked like a family that didn't have a care in the world, mostly because I had just paid for all of it. The receipt was still warm in my hand. $2,400, the cost of admission to a life I was never actually allowed to live. Kelsey tapped her spoon against her glass again. The room quieted. She smoothed her silk dress and looked directly at me through the glass, her smile tight and dismissive. She waved her hand, a shooing motion like I was a stray dog that had wandered too close to the buffet. "Sydney," she mouthed, exaggerating the syllables so I could read her lips. "You ruin the aesthetic." My mother nodded, turning her back to me to adjust Kelsey's veil. They didn't even wait to see if I left. They just assumed I would. Because that was the deal. I paid, they took, and then I disappeared until the next invoice arrived. I looked down at the receipt. It wasn't just paper. It was a contract I had finally decided to breach. I didn't cry. I didn't bang on the glass. I simply folded the receipt, placed it in my pocket, and walked toward the elevator. The transaction was complete, and so were we. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the view of the celebration. The silence in the metal box was heavy, but it wasn't lonely. It was protective. I pulled my phone from my clutch. My screen was already lighting up with a text from my mother, Christina. "You embarrassed us. Where are you going?" I didn't reply. I didn't type out a justification. I simply tapped the information icon next to her name and selected block caller. Then I did the same for my father, David. And finally for Kelsey. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, my digital world was as silent as the physical one. I hailed a cab and gave the driver my address. As the city lights blurred past the window, I let myself dissect the anatomy of the last 5 years. People always ask why victims of financial abuse stay. They assume we are weak or stupid or naive. I was none of those things. I was an architect. I understood structure and stability better than anyone. But I had fallen victim to the oldest psychological trap in the book, the sunk cost fallacy. For years, I had treated my adoptive family like a slot machine. Every time I paid a bill, every time I covered a crisis, every time I smoothed over a disaster with my own savings, I was feeding a coin into the slot. I convinced myself that if I just put in enough coins, eventually the lights would flash, the bells would ring, and the jackpot of love and acceptance would pour out. I thought if I invested enough, they would have no choice but to value me. Tonight, looking at that receipt, I finally understood the game. The machine wasn't cold. It wasn't due for a payout. It was rigged. There was no jackpot. There was only the endless, hungry mouth of the coin slot designed to take until I was empty. Paying that bill upstairs hadn't been an act of submission. It was the final coin I was willing to lose to prove once and for all that the game was broken. When I unlocked the door to my apartment, the air was still and clean. My space was minimalist, precise, a stark contrast to the chaotic, expensive clutter of my parents' home. I didn't take off my coat. I walked straight to my desk and opened my laptop. I didn't need to search for the files. I knew exactly where they were. I opened a spreadsheet titled simply The Ledger. It was a document I had started 5 years ago, not out of malice but out of a desperate need to track where my salary was going. I scrolled to the top. The first entry was from 5 years ago, Brandon's transmission repair, $1,200. My younger brother had wrecked his car, and my father claimed they were liquidity challenged. I paid it. I scrolled down. Kelsey's tuition supplement, $4,000. David's back taxes, $8,500. Christina's medical emergency spa retreat, $3,000. Row after row. Column after column. The numbers blurred into a single, massive figure at the bottom right. I had funded their lifestyle while I lived in a studio apartment and shopped at discount grocers. I had been their safety net, their venture capitalist, and their retirement plan, all while they introduced me to their friends as our independent daughter, with a tone that implied I was cold and distant. They called me cold because I worked hard enough to afford the warmth they felt entitled to steal. I stared at the blinking cursor. This document was no longer just a personal record, it was a weapon. I hit print. The printer whirred to life in the corner, a rhythmic mechanical sound that felt like a heartbeat. Page 1 slid out, then page 2, then page 3. It took a long time to print 12 pages of exploitation. I picked up the stack of warm paper. It had weight, it had mass. For the first time, my sacrifice wasn't invisible. It was right there in black and white ink. I set the stack on my desk right next to the receipt from tonight's dinner. The audit was finished. Now the collection process would begin. I woke up the next morning not to sunlight but to the vibration of my phone on the nightstand. It had been buzzing intermittently all night, a persistent, angry insect I had trapped in silence. I picked it up. My lock screen was a wall of notifications. Missed calls from blocked numbers, voicemails from unknown callers, and text messages from neighbors and family friends I hadn't spoken to in years. My mother, Christina, had bypassed the block by using our next-door neighbor's phone. The message was time-stamped 7:04 a.m. Sydney, this is selfish and dramatic even for you. Your father is sick with worry. We need that credit card for the venue deposit today. Come back and apologize or don't bother coming for Christmas. You are destroying this family. I stared at the words. Selfish. Dramatic. Destroying. The vocabulary of the narcissist. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about the deposit. The family they were accusing me of destroying was actually just their financial ecosystem, and I had just removed the keystone species. I didn't reply. I didn't feel the old familiar panic, the urge to smooth things over, to apologize for taking up space to fix it. Instead, I felt a strange, cold calm. I swiped the notification away. Then I opened Instagram. My sister Kelsey had been busy. She had posted a photo from the engagement party. It was a group shot, my parents Kelsey, her fiancé, and my brother Brandon, all laughing, holding champagne flutes. The caption read, "So grateful to be surrounded by real family who supports me unconditionally. Sad that some people choose jealousy over joy, but we won't let negativity ruin our blessings. Family first, blessed real love." The comments were a chorus of validation. You deserve the best, ignore the haters, love you guys. They were rewriting history in real time. I was being painted as the bitter, jealous spinster who couldn't handle her sister's happiness. It was a narrative they had been seeding for years. Sydney the workaholic, Sydney the cold one, Sydney the outsider. Now they were harvesting it. I sat at my kitchen island, coffee in hand, and looked at the stack of papers I had printed the night before. The ledger. 12 pages of undeniable financial truth. My brother Brandon texted me from a burner app. "Yo, Dad's losing it. Just send the card info so he can pay the vendor. Stop being a psycho." I took a sip of coffee. The steam curled up, disappearing into the quiet air of my apartment. I remembered the time Brandon had called me a psycho for refusing to pay his parking tickets right before I paid them anyway, because my father said family helps family. Not today. I picked up the ledger and slid it into my leather portfolio. I dressed in my sharpest suit, charcoal gray, tailored severe. I wasn't dressing for a family meeting. I was dressing for war. I walked out of my apartment and into the morning light. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. I ignored it. Let them scream into the void. Let them spin their stories. I had the receipts and I was done paying the bill. My architecture firm was a fortress of glass and steel in the center of the financial district. It was the one place in my life that operated on logic, physics, and merit. When I walked through the revolving doors, I usually felt a sense of relief, but today, the air in the lobby felt charged. Sitting on one of the Barcelona chairs, looking entirely out of place and yet completely in command, was Great Aunt Catherine. My steps faltered for a fraction of a second. Catherine was the family pariah. In the mythology of my adoptive family, she was the villain, the cold, wealthy widow who had abandoned the family to hoard her fortune. My mother, Christina, called her the witch. My father, David, refused to speak her name. I hadn't seen her since I was 10 years old, but I recognized the posture. She sat with a spine of steel, dressed in a tailored cream suit that probably cost more than my first car. She saw me. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply stood up, picking up a thick, leather-bound file folder from the seat beside her. "Sydney," she said, Her voice was like dry ice. "We need a room, somewhere without ears." I didn't ask why she was here. I didn't ask how she knew where I worked. I simply nodded and led her past the receptionist scanning my badge to open the secure doors. We walked in silence to Conference Room B, a soundproof glass box overlooking the river. I closed the door. "Hello, Aunt Catherine." "Don't waste time on pleasantries," she said, placing the heavy file on the mahogany table. "I saw what happened last night. The rooftop. The bill. The exit." I stiffened. "How, you weren't there?" "I have eyes everywhere, Sydney. I've been watching you for 11 months. The confession hung in the air. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that the coldness my family complained about wasn't malice. It was precision. It was the same look I saw in the mirror. "Why?" I asked. "If you've been watching, why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you help me when I was paying for Brandon's car or Kelsey's tuition?" Catherine sat down, folding her hands over the file. "Because you weren't ready." This was the perspective of the silent witness. She explained that she had tracked the financial abuse for years. She knew about the emotional blackmail. She knew about the exclusion, but she also knew the psychology of the victim. "If I had intervened 6 months ago," Catherine said, her voice steady and factual, "you would have defended them. You would have said they were struggling. You would have used my money to bail them out again. I couldn't save you, Sydney. You had to save yourself first. You had to be the one to walk away from the table." She tapped the file with a manicured fingernail. "Last night you finally cut the cord. You stopped the transaction. That means you are finally ready to see what I have in here." I looked at the folder. It was thick, stuffed with documents. "What is it?" I asked. "Proof," Catherine said. "Your mother told you that your birth parents died penniless. She told you that she and David took you in out of the goodness of their hearts despite the financial burden." "Yes," I said. "They remind me of it every Christmas." Catherine's eyes flashed with a sudden terrifying anger. It was the only crack in her armor. "Lies," she hissed. "Your parents didn't leave you nothing, Sydney. They left you everything. And for 25 years, Christina and David haven't just been using you. They have been stealing from you." She slid the file across the table. "Open it." I opened the file. The first page wasn't a bank statement. It was a letter yellowed with age, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. It was dated 25 years ago, 2 weeks before my birth parents died in the car accident that redefined my existence. "To our daughter, Sydney. So you will always have a foundation." Below it was a bank statement from the year I turned 18. The balance wasn't zero. It was $1,400,000. The air in the conference room seemed to vanish. I couldn't breathe. My mother Christina had drilled a specific narrative into my head since I was old enough to understand money. She told me my birth parents were irresponsible dreamers who died with mountains of debt. She told me that she and David had taken me in at great personal financial risk, that raising me was an act of charity that nearly bankrupted them. It was the guilt I had carried my entire life. It was the reason I paid their bills without question. "They lied," I whispered. The words felt heavy like stones dropping into deep water. "They didn't just lie," Catherine said, her voice sharp and precise. She reached over and turned the page to a legal document. It listed Christina as the trustee, and Catherine as the original executor. "I set this trust up with your father," Catherine said. "I was supposed to watch over it, but when you were 7, David came to me with tears in his eyes. He showed me documents, forged documents I know now, claiming the entire fund had been wiped out by bad investments during the market crash. They told me there was nothing left. They told me they were struggling to feed you." Catherine's hand clenched into a fist on the mahogany table. I believed them. I stepped back. I let them play the martyrs because I thought they were actually sacrificing to raise you. I didn't know I was leaving the fox in charge of the henhouse. I flipped through the pages. The file was a forensic autopsy of my stolen life. I saw the withdrawal records. They weren't for my education or my health care. Withdrawal $12,000. Kelsey's private school tuition. Withdrawal $55,000. David's consulting business capital. Withdrawal $8,000. Family vacation, Disney World. I remembered that vacation. They went when I was 12. They left me with a neighbor because they said they couldn't afford a ticket for me. I sat in Mrs. Higgins' living room for a week, thinking I was a burden while they spent my inheritance on mouse ears and hotel suites. I turned to the most recent page. The transaction was dated 3 days ago. Withdrawal. $25,000. Venetian rooftop deposit. The world tilted on its axis. I hadn't just paid the $2,400 bar tab last night. I had paid for the entire engagement party. The venue, the flowers, the champagne, it was all funded by the ghosts of the parents who actually loved me. Christina and David hadn't just used me as an ATM. They had cannibalized my future to feed their golden child. I looked up at Catherine. The shock was gone. In its place was a cold, vibrating rage that felt like an engine turning over. They stole $1 million from an orphan, I said. It wasn't a question. With interest and market growth, Catherine corrected, they stole nearly $3 million. And they are still doing it. They think the well is bottomless. She reached into her purse and pulled out 2 envelopes. They were thick, cream-colored, and sealed with the wax emblem of her high-powered law firm. This, she said, tapping the first envelope, is a cease and desist order freezing every asset they own. This, she tapped the second, is a criminal complaint for embezzlement and fraud. She looked at me, her eyes matching mine, hard, dark, and unforgiving. They are hosting a brunch this morning, Catherine said. At the country club. To celebrate the engagement. I stood up. I didn't need to ask where the money for the brunch came from. I closed the file. Let's go, I said. I think it's time we crashed the party. The country club brunch was a sea of pastel linens and forced laughter. From the entryway, I watched them. My family was holding court at the center table, surrounded by extended relatives and Kelsey's future in-laws. My father, David, was standing with a mimosa in hand midway through a toast about the sanctity of family support. The irony was so thick I could taste it metallic and bitter. Beside me, Great-Aunt Catherine adjusted her silk scarf. She looked like a general surveying a battlefield she had already wired for demolition. Ready? She asked. Let's burn it down, I said. We walked in. The silence spread outward from the door like a shockwave. Heads turned, glasses lowered. When my mother Christina saw us, her smile curdled into a mask of panic. She stood up too quickly, her chair screeching against the marble floor. Sydney, she hissed, rushing toward us to intercept the scene before it reached the head table. What are you doing here? You were uninvited. And bringing her. This is a private event. It's not a private event, Christina, Catherine said, her voice carrying effortlessly across the room. It's a crime scene. The room went dead silent. David froze his glass halfway to his mouth. Kelsey looked up from her plate of fruit, her eyes darting between me and the thick envelope in Catherine's hand. Don't cause a scene, Christina whispered, her eyes manic. We can talk later. Just leave. No, I said. My voice was calm. It was the voice I used when telling a contractor a load-bearing wall was failing. We're done talking. We're here to serve notice. Catherine stepped past my mother and walked straight to the head table. She didn't yell. She didn't throw a drink. She simply placed the legal documents on the white tablecloth right next to the floral centerpiece I had unknowingly paid for. David. Christina, Catherine said, these are notices of a federal lawsuit for embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. As of 9 o'clock this morning, your assets have been frozen. The house, the accounts, the business capital, all of it. David dropped his glass. It shattered, orange juice and champagne splashing onto his Italian loafers. You can't do that, he stammered. That money, we raised her. It was reimbursement. We took her in when no one else would. You didn't take me in, I said, stepping forward. You took my trust fund in. I was just the packaging. The guests were murmuring now. I saw Kelsey's fiancé, a man who cared deeply about optics, slowly pull his hand away from hers. Kelsey sensed the shift. She looked at her parents, panic rising in her chest like rising water. Frozen Kelsey asked, her voice shrill. What does that mean? What about the wedding payments? The vendor checks go out tomorrow. There are no checks, Kelsey, I said. The well is dry. But the money, Kelsey spun on our mother. You said there was plenty. You said the trust was practically infinite. Christina lunged for her daughter, trying to shush her, but it was too late. The pressure was too high and the structure was too weak. Kelsey shoved her hand away and stood up, her face twisted in a tantrum of pure entitlement. You told me it was my money, Kelsey screamed. The sound tore through the room. You told me Sydney was just the help. You said her parents left it for us because they owed you. The confession hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. She knew. All this time, the golden child knew exactly where the gold came from. She hadn't just been spoiled. She had been complicit. I looked to my left. The wedding videographer hired to capture candid family moments was standing 10 feet away. His camera was raised. The red recording light was steady and unblinking. He had it all. The fraud, the confession, the collapse. Christina looked at the camera, then at her wealthy future in-laws who were staring at her with expressions of absolute horror. She realized in that second that her social currency had just been devalued to zero. "It's a misunderstanding," David tried, his voice cracking. "We can explain." "You can explain it to the district attorney," Catherine said. "We've already filed the criminal complaint." I looked at them one last time, my mother trembling in her designer dress, my father broken and small, my sister sobbing not for the crime but for the loss of her budget. They looked like strangers. "Come on, Aunt Catherine," I said, turning my back on the wreckage. "I have a new life to build." We walked out the way we came, leaving the silence behind us. I didn't look back. The fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely self-inflicted. By Monday morning, the video of Kelsey's screaming confession had been leaked not by me but by one of the guests who realized the perfect family narrative was a lie worth exposing. It went viral within hours. The internet didn't see a bride under stress. They saw a spoiled accomplice furious that her stolen lifestyle had been repossessed. David and Christina were indicted 2 weeks later. The charges included wire fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. Because the amounts crossed state lines and involved banking institutions, the federal prosecutors were involved. They faced years in prison, not weeks. Kelsey's fiancé left her before the ink was dry on the cancellation checks. He issued a public statement about misrepresented values and disappeared back into his own wealthy, scandal-free world. Without the trust fund to prop her up, Kelsey had nothing, no career, no husband, and no reputation. I sat in my new office 3 months later. It was a space I had designed myself, clean lines, natural light, structural integrity. On my desk were the plans for the foundation, a community center for foster youth funded entirely by the Recovered Trust. I was no longer building on sand. I was building on bedrock. I thought about the metaphor of the paper house. My family had built a beautiful, enviable life. From the outside, it looked perfect, the parties, the clothes, the status, but it was all just paper walls held up by the money they stole from me. They had spent 20 years painting the paper to look like marble, convincing the world it was solid, but the moment I pulled my support, the moment I stopped being the load-bearing wall they abused, the entire structure collapsed. It had no foundation. It had no truth. Great Aunt Catherine walked in carrying 2 coffees. She set one down on my drafting table. She was my partner now, helping me manage the trust she had originally created. "Ready for the site visit?" she asked. "Always," I said. I picked up my phone. 0 missed calls from my mother, 0 texts from my father. They were allowed 1 call a week from the detention center, and they used it to call lawyers, not me. I smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached my eyes. I turned off my phone and slid it into my drawer. The transaction was finally permanently closed. If you've ever felt like you were paying for a seat at your own family's table, share this story. Remind the world you are not a bank account. You are the prize.